All right, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and kick this thing off. Thank you to everyone for attending. This webinar should be about 45 minutes with 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A section as you have them. We will get to as many as we can get to at the end. I am Reid Calhoun with ClimateWells. We are a project developer focused on methane and super pollutants. Our work is focused on shutting down old oil fields across North America. I wanted to put this webinar together because, in my opinion, in environmental markets, we often talk about what the impact is, whether it's reduction versus removal or nature-based versus engineered, but we talk far less about when it happens. In fact, holding quality constant, projects that can't deliver their impacts for 10 or 20 years often charge a premium to projects that can deliver today. And I didn't understand that. I thought it should be the other way around. So today, I'm lucky to be joined by a group of individuals who have spent quite a bit of time in the carbon markets. First, we have Justin Freiberg, Managing Director of the Carbon Containment Lab, which supports both super pollutant and carbon removal solutions. Ben Macdonald, who built the Climate Market and Infrastructure Group at Bloomberg. Thomas Annicq, who manages the Open Carbon Protocol, a registry in the voluntary carbon market that separates methodology development from credit issuance through an independent review process. And Toby Janson-Smith, former Chief Program and Innovation Officer at Verra, a standard setter in the VCM, and current CEO of Credegra, helping streamline the certification process. Gentlemen, thank you for joining the webinar today. I'm going to get right into it. And Justin, I'm coming to you first. Given your work in both carbon removal and super pollutant projects, why does the speed of impact matter? And sort of holding that quality constant, should faster projects receive more preference? What's the scientific and ethical rationale for acting quickly?
Thanks, Reid. Let me confirm, first of all, that yes, it does matter. And I think the speed of impact matters both. It reduces damages, it reduces costs, and it buys us time to build long-term solutions that we need to do. So at the CC Lab, as you noted, we work on both CO2 removal as well as super pollutants. And there's room for all of this stuff to coexist, but we think there needs to be a lot more emphasis on super pollutants. And I think that speaks to exactly the time value that we're looking at here. For those unfamiliar with super pollutants, I thought I'd kind of kick us off here and give a brief intro to why they're so important here. So they have a very short atmospheric lifetime. We're talking days to a few decades. And whether you're talking about black carbon, tropospheric ozone, methane, or hydrofluorocarbons, they're all vastly more powerful than CO2 in terms of their radiative forcing effect. So once they end up in the atmosphere, they're going to cause a lot more damage, even if they're there for a relatively short amount of time. So thus the importance of dealing with them right now before they end up there, even though they can break down quickly. I think the equation has changed. If you were to look at this 35 years ago, it's a different scenario than if you look at it right now. I hate to bring it back to the oft-used bathtub analogy, but I think it kind of can base a lot of people in thinking about these in a similar fashion as we do. But when we think about the bathtub as the atmosphere, and this old analogy, and the spigot as being the emissions ending up into the atmosphere, and the drain being sinks, taking CO2 or other emissions out of the atmosphere, these were traditionally in pre-industrial times at relative balance. And so in those times, and even 50 years ago, as the tub started to increase and fill up, adding a short-lived climate pollutant here would not have been quite as damaging. And in this analogy, I'll extend it to think about a super pollutant or short-lived climate pollutant as a kid jumping in the bathtub. It's going to displace a lot of water. It's going to raise the level within that tub, but the kid's going to get out in 10 minutes. So tub level will sink back down. So if the tub levels were low enough, if levels in the atmosphere indeed were where they should be, not as much of a problem. But now that we've reached the level of atmospheric CO2 that we have, the tub is full to the brim. We're at like 1.5 C now, above pre-industrial levels. This is a problem. So if we throw a kid in this bathtub, or maybe he jumps in, say the kid is methane in this analogy, we're going to have this overflow, even if the kid's getting out in 10 minutes. And so that's damages. That's how we think about these damages that occur because of raising greenhouse gas levels. So the water overflows. Let's say this tub was installed on a wood floor, not very smartly, but the wood floor warps and expands. Now another kid's gonna jump in the tub too. Let's say this is refrigerants, hydrofluorocarbons getting in there too. More water's coming out, and these damages are going to start to kind of accrue further. We're moving towards tipping points, in fact. So now the water is not just expanding those floorboards, it's heading down through those floorboards into say it's the wall, the ceiling of the apartment below, and add another kid to the tub, even more water damage that's now heading down, hitting the electrical system. So the point being that if these tub levels were lower, these super pollutants would not be as much of an issue because they are relatively short-lived within the atmosphere. But because we've arrived where we have, we need to deal with them. We can't, right now, they play this outsized effect in causing damages. And in fact, moving us towards these critical tipping points that are that cost a lot, that cause a lot more damage. But to come out of that tub analogy and back to the real world, we have this ethical obligation to act right now as well when we think about dealing with super pollutants. These damages are real. They're happening right now to the tune of trillions of dollars, and they're happening to the people and the communities that are least responsible for having put these greenhouse gases up in the atmosphere. So why do we do it? We do it because we should. And I'd also say we should do these right now because we can, because a lot of these solutions are viable right now.
Super helpful, and probably the most visual of the bathtub analogies that I've had the opportunity to think through. So any other notes on that before I move on to the next one, guys? All right. Ben and Thomas, both of you have spent time thinking about carbon projects as financial assets. Are there emerging frameworks that reward earlier impact? How do you see the financial markets driving faster climate action?
Yeah, so the time value of carbon that we're talking about functions very much like the time value of money. Just as when you save for your retirement, you don't do it at the end. You start as soon as possible because that early action, those early savings have more impact. For climate, the same thing happens. I think there are a lot of reasons why that this concept has not percolated enough into everyone's psyche. And I think, first of all, is that we talk about the wrong things. We talk about carbon footprints rather than cumulative emissions, right? It's not like the carbon footprint is like, what did you what are you responsible for this year, rather than cumulatively it's like what has been compounding. I think the other component is that the consequences of this compounding effect is not linear, but it's exponential, right? Like we always have the tendency to just extrapolate linearly, but this is exponential, and Justin touched on it with his concept of tipping points and these feedback loops that just makes it exponentially works. And I think what this decarbonization curve that we've all seen so many times, right? Like every year that we delay that action, that incline just keeps getting steeper, and it just gets more expensive to catch up. And so that's true at a global level, but it's also true at a corporate level. And so the question that we keep asking everyone is how would your behavior change if you looked at every ton of emissions that you as an organization are responsible for as a liability, and every credit that you engage with, every positive climate action as an asset? I'm sure Ben will address it as well, that temporal matching is very important. So every year that you've not decarbonized, your liabilities just compound, right? They just keep adding up. And if you don't build up assets at the same time as an organization, your financial picture gets worse and worse. Like your access to capital is going to be impacted, and it's going to be harder and more expensive to catch up. And we are convinced that this accounting framework is going to become a reality much sooner than people think. So yeah, I'll leave some room for Ben as well.
Thanks, Thomas. So when I got into climate a couple of years ago, coming from 20 years in financial services, there were a lot of things that didn't make sense to me, and some which still don't, to be perfectly honest. I think just to kind of dovetail on what Justin was saying, it's very clear when you look at the problem that we face today, top down, in terms of the global carbon budget and the amount at which we're eating through that as a species or an ecosystem on an annual basis. We don't have a lot of time left now. Just to kind of extend that a little bit, what that actually means, or the way it was explained to me, is that the probability of really bad things happening is going to become much greater than the probability of them not happening. And so just to kind of keep moving on that, bathtub analogy, which I love. Fortunately, I've got tiled floors, but the cost of mitigation is going to become more and more expensive. And so just logically, if you know that the cost over time is going to become more and more expensive, then the price of things to fix that and mitigate that is suddenly going to go up more and more expensive. So just that kind of macro level, that buying now is probably a safer bet than waiting for some point in the future. At the same time, I think if you look at this ecosystem, on the one side of the equation, on the balance sheet, you've got where the emissions are coming from. Some are not. Some are always going to be there just by the nature of the source and needs for energy and things like that, and that's totally reasonable. But at the same time, you want to build an ecosystem where those emitting entities are incentivized to reduce their emissions, i.e., the capex that they would invest for reduction is actually more effective than managing that on an opex basis, i.e., funding those liabilities year on year on year. And so I think that's, for me, one of the really missing pieces of this overall paradigm is how do we connect through accounting, verification, audit and things like that, the emitting side of the equation with the mitigation and reduction side of the equation. And I think that's a little bit what's lacking here. And the reason why I think that's so important is that, for me anyway, personally, the financial markets are a huge piece of this puzzle, and today they've been lacking. And the reason they've been lacking is you can't make money financing projects. And the reason you can't make money is because you don't know what the future price of carbon is going to be. You can kind of guess at it. So there's some really sophisticated people who have great technology and IP who are doing a very good job as private buyers, effectively, at buying up the carbon. Yeah, and a big piece of me kind of thinks these guys are, they're doing the right thing. They know what's going to happen in the future, because I think it's somewhat inevitable when you look at the carbon budget, and they're getting ahead of that because it's just good for business. With that said, I think that we need the financial markets to be able to want to bring private capital into this space to finance projects. And in order for them to do that, they've got to be able to, one, have a stable framework, which is a forward price of carbon that makes sense and is based in reality, not in kind of somewhat arbitrary data. And then also you want them to, when they look at managing physical risk and transition risk, and managing the risk of investing in a company, looking at that company's liability based off those bad events happening and the cost of fixing them, or transition risk, which is at the end of the day really about how much is it going to cost for that company to become to transition to a green economy. We don't know what that inflection point is going to be, because it's going to be very much dependent, I think, both on some of the things that happen at a climate level, but also on the political environment. But it will happen at some point. That's my belief. And I think that the companies that start getting ahead of that are going to be winners in the long run, because they'll be able to do much better than their peers in terms of managing that risk. So I think my perspective on a lot of this is I'm definitely not an expert on the project side, and a lot of folks here know much more than I do about it. I look at it more from a kind of overall ecosystem perspective, and how do we build an accounting framework that interconnects both the emitting side as well as the mitigation and the reduction side. And I think capitalism, in the same way that capitalism fueled the Industrial Revolution, at the end of the day, like the essence, the genesis of the capital markets is at some level based off the Industrial Revolution, where money was needed to be able to retool the economies, to be able to rebuild infrastructure, and ultimately make everybody's quality of life a lot better. I think this is no different. And so I think if you think of it this way, you can think about the capital markets as being able to be a positive influence in driving much better outcomes for the planet. I'll stop there.
Super helpful insights. Toby and Thomas, what if any changes need to be made in the voluntary carbon market to incentivize faster action, what are some of the ways that registries can play a role? Can you speak to any carbon accounting techniques like discount rates, for instance, that could impact delivery timeframes?
Thanks, Reid. I'm happy to go first, Thomas, and then maybe you could add in the good work you're doing over at oneshot.earth. So, I mean, I think the first thing, Reid, is we need good methodologies that are covering these activities, that are getting the super pollutants or reducing the super pollutants and doing it quickly. And of course, ClimateWells is doing excellent work on the ground, and it's great to see, with the open registry, what's going on with the early decommissioning of marginal oil and gas protocol. And I think that is, the Open Carbon Protocol is a great innovative platform that Thomas can talk a bit more about, that starts to give confidence to buyers and others in the market about the quality of the emission reductions that can be generated from these super pollutants. So I think that's job one. We need solid frameworks and methodologies, ideally ICBCM compliant or seen as high quality across the market. And then I think we need to think about, how we actually credit these things. Obviously, most of the standards bodies use the IPCC's greenhouse gas global warming potential at 100 years. So you're discounting or basically calculating the overall impact of a given gas like methane over 100 years. But that inherently sort of under or discounts the potency and near-term impact of some of those gases like methane. And so I think that's probably not going to change anytime soon, because I think that the norm is around this 100-year time frame of GHG global warming potential. But I think it's good for buyers and actors in the market to recognize that inherent perhaps asymmetry and the value of really making sure that we're doing everything we can to keep these super pollutants like methane out of the atmosphere. And clearly, the value of that, not just in terms of near-term climate value, but buying us more time to work on technologies and other approaches to draw down to reduce emissions and draw down emissions is going to be critical. And in terms of discount rates, more generally, besides this 100-year time frame, of course, we can look at even the social cost of carbon and future generations. And there's obviously a debate about how high or low we should consider discount rates. But I think there's a strong case to be made for high discount rates that should incentivize this early action and early accounting of these super pollutants and short-lived emission sources. And so I think those are things that we can all explore and consider. But maybe, Thomas, you could say something a bit about your great work on the registry side, trying to build confidence around the credits that are coming from these super pollutants.
Thanks, Toby. Where to start? So I think there are a couple of inefficiencies that exist in the market and that are there, for not because of malice, but just because of historic reasons. And I think this concept of carbon credits as a commodity, as every ton being a ton, is not very helpful when you're looking at plugging of a well, and you compare that to the protecting of a tree, or you compare that to a machine that removes carbon from the atmosphere. They are massively different, have very different risk profiles, and have very different permanences. They're different on tons of different axes. And I think the role that we see registries needing to play is to bring transparency around the risk and the complexities that these credits have, so that buyers can, with more knowledge, engage with these credits and actually compare apples to apples, and price that premium of the time impact. I think because of the complexity of this market and the headwinds that it's received, there's been inaction is prized over action today, and it should be the other way around. the perceived risks of newer versus older methodologies. I think the ecosystem marketplace gave us a statistic. It was like there's a 217% premium of a credit that was issued this year versus 5 years ago. That's insane, right? Like it should be the other way around, which makes me think that there could be an arbitrage opportunity there. And then there's this this idea that we need to get to fungibility as quickly as possible, but that's difficult with this temporal lens on it as well, right? But what we've seen in the last couple of years is that the markets have started to reward risk-adjusted pricing. If you look at a carbon credit with a high rating, that will trade at a premium compared to credits with a lower rating, and so we would argue for a time-adjusted premium as well. That needs to happen. But I think one of the big things that all of us keep fighting against is this. It is very complex. There is a lot of nuance, and people are just drawn to silver bullets. And our role is to make that nuance as transparent as possible and easily to digest as possible. The directionality is clear, right? We know where we need to head. Sometimes there is imprecision, but the premium should be on action versus inaction.
Very helpful. Now I have one for everybody here. So Google recently made a landmark purchase of credits from refrigerants and methane projects. This is really the first super pollutant purchase in recent years from one of the larger sort of removals focused credit buyers. What should chief sustainability officers and carbon buyers prioritize in terms of timing? If you're advising a credit purchaser today, how should they focus their capital? Anybody can take that one.
I mean, one thing I'd just say generally is I think it's going to be really helpful and critical for a lot of the major buyers that are not just climate leaders in their own right, but are sending signals that others are following and establishing precedents to start to think about going beyond just removals and starting to make sure in their portfolios they're including credits from emission reductions. And even beyond that, making sure where possible they're using or tapping projects that are generating emission reductions in the near term, whether that's through methane, whether that's through avoided loss of forests, and things like that, as well as balancing that with removals. But we can't just focus on removals. One is, of course, the cost of those types of activities can be much higher. But perhaps more importantly, the timing of those removals often is far further pushed out. So we look at that on an industrial or engineering scale, building direct air capture or BECCS or other types of technologies that can take a lot longer to deploy at scale. So we're then losing time in terms of tackling climate change. And then similarly, even on the nature-based side, of course, growing trees and sequestering carbon takes longer than making sure we're not putting more biological carbon into the atmosphere by conserving ecosystems, which has to be a priority as well. So I think that's one thing that buyers, should really be thinking about, is making sure there's a balance in their portfolio of emission reductions and emission removals, and then where possible, prioritizing early action activities. And then finally, prioritizing areas or actions that can be scaled. There's no way we're going to tackle the climate crisis or get to 1.5 degree future unless we get that kind of scale. And so it takes the leaders to help to unlock that by making those early investments, showing what's possible, making sure we've got the right methodologies, protocols, and finance flowing into those activities so we can get to the right scale and impact.
Yeah. I think, we need it all and we need it as quickly as possible. But then I echo what Toby says, like we need a portfolio approach. But there's two lenses that are very important in building that portfolio. One is time. And then the other one to me is scale. The ability to scale is a quality feature as well. Because again, that compounding effect is real. there are really cool innovations that can be done, right? Like we looked at for OneShot's own portfolio, we looked at carbon credits that were issued. I think it's 2019 or 2020. It was landfill gas projects, and when you look at the latest scientific research, it doesn't match up with the methodology of that time, and as a result, with these credits were overcredited, but that is an easy adjustment to make. The redoing that accounting, you can get these older credits back up to a standard that would meet today's lenses, to today's quality requirements, and as a result, you have credits that have been having an impact for much longer. I think the other thing that we explored was this concept of hybrid credits. There's a lot of, in the carbon removal space, credit types that are going to take a long time before they actually start sequestering carbon. And in the meantime, if you pair that with a short-lived pollutant, for example, you create this hybrid credit that delivers from the moment that they're issued. And so there's like lots of ideas out there that can help you. But yeah, we are long super pollutants as well, with Reid's projects and Reid's methodology, with ClimateWells methodology, with the work we're doing with the Carbon Containment Lab on HFCs, what we're doing with trade water on the orphan oil and gas wells. Like, yes, these super pollutants are our best emergency action that we can take today.
Just to add to good points already made here, I think the one, this is sort of an amalgamation or a different version of what's been noted here, but I would stress a buyer to think about the value they're getting for the dollar they spend right now, and just how much more impact you can get in, no matter how you slice it right now, when you look at super pollutants versus removals. You might think, but I love the portfolio approach. I think we need to invest in these long-term solutions that can come down the cost curve. But right now, I'd really stress that there's so much value to be had for dollars put into super pollutant projects.
So I actually have that number in front of me. So since 2018, there's been $6 billion spent on what we think of as durable carbon removal. I'm just drawing that from CDR.FYI. That's 900,000 tons of CO2 equivalent delivered to date from that 6 billion. In the same time frame, there's been only 700 million spent on methane destruction and over 150 million tons of CO2 equivalent driven from that. So it's a 160 times more impact for 1/10 the cost. So meaningful difference in how far a dollar can go in each one of these commodities. Any other thoughts or advice to demand side players, Ben or Toby?
I think from my side.
No, not right now.
All right. So I'm going to go to some Q&A. We actually have quite a few questions here, both in the chat and in the Q&A section. I'll start with the one that's sitting in Q&A at the moment. Pull that up. So the question is the inherent risk in delayed impact not a sufficient driver for action, especially for markets such as forestry, which are prone to sudden and catastrophic losses?
Whose question is? I'm just trying to reread it.
It's in the Q&A section. It's Dr. Malcolm Toby.
Okay, hold on. I'm in the wrong.
I mean, my answer up top would be no, simply because we've had an inherent risk in delayed impact for quite some time and are seeing significantly delayed action. But I would hope that the risks of delayed climate action would drive a bunch of capital in, but we've seen a stagnant voluntary carbon market for the last 3 years, as we've seen a bunch of outside arms being done. So I'm not sure that that's enough.
I think the big issue here is that the risk of being called out for doing something that's not perfect outweighs actually at the moment the inherent risk of the delayed impact. And that's a huge problem that needs to be addressed. And I think it's because of the lack of transparency around the complexity of these instruments and the risks that these instruments have. But what's exciting is that we now have in this ecosystem, we have rating agencies, we have insurance companies that are addressing these risks, right, and trying to tackle that. I also, I think the framing of carbon credits as assets rather than offsets is a very helpful one, because if you consider a carbon credit an asset, if your trees grow faster, or if they burn down, that is an accounting adjustment that you're then making to your assets. That's something that we do all the time, versus having, if there were an offset for something, a net zero pledge you had 2 years ago, there's no consequence, and that makes it easily attackable. So I think this accounting framework needs to evolve.
There are quite a few questions in the chat around this accounting framework, specifically discount rates. Paris Agreement has a feeling on temperature. We talked a little bit about the time value of carbon. And Toby, I know you hit on how maybe high discount rates should be something that's employed as we think about these credits. What is a high discount rate for you? Do you have a feeling for how to determine the right difference in importance between a ton reduced and removed today versus one next year or the year after?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a tricky topic, right? Because I think many people, we don't want to saddle, we want to think about future generations, we want to think about these long-term time horizons, and I think that's led to generally quite low discount rates in various government or even framework analyses, down to 2%, and we've seen that 2-3%. But I think there's equally some other research and other cases where the discount rates have gone up as high as 7%, which starts to prioritize and incentivize and value early action. And I think that can be justified. So I think it's a healthy debate, just like the global warming potential over 100 years. I think these are things we need to be looking at. And I think we need to kind of tackle square on. And it's not just about planned action or investing in long-term engineered solutions and removals. It's about what can get the job done at scale, cost effectively now, and what do we need to invest in and develop to make that happen. And I think that discussion, including discount rates, hasn't happened enough. I think often action sort of can sit behind quality or long-term plans, and I think we just need to start this conversation about timing and the different levers, including discount rates, that could help us get there.
I would echo that. I think to me it's almost more important to just put a stick in the ground somewhere and know it's not going to be perfect, but then start acting based on that, rather than waiting for someone else to do it for you. And I think, it's action versus waiting.
Now, Toby, you have a question in here around ton year accounting. I believe that was reviewed at Verra. You've probably spoken on this already, but any feedback that you can provide on how registries have looked at that concept?
Yeah. I mean, for those of our listeners participants that aren't aware, ton year accounting is basically the idea that instead of thinking about a permanent ton or a semi-permanent ton up to 100 years, which is what a lot of the current registries and methodologies consider or account around, ensuring that, for example, a nature-based reduction or removal is maintained for at least 100 years through its approach and through buffers and insurance and other mechanisms. The idea of a ton year, so that's meant to create some level of fungibility amongst the credits, and there's a lot of value in that for simplified accounting and portfolios, etc. However, what that can do is shut out viable and attractive and scalable actions that maybe just operate over a short time horizon. And a good example of that might be a forest management activity that changes in the, just for a few years, or maybe delays harvesting and allows more biomass to accumulate, more carbon to be removed, changes the management practices that drives other emission reductions in the near term, but then maybe later those emissions still accumulate. So tenure accounting enables those kinds of activities to be accounted for on a basically year by year basis. So they can be credited and that it all adds up. And the trick there is, how do you discount or account for, say, 1 year of tenure? So if let's just say a forest management project is able to delay the harvesting of the trees and accumulate extra carbon for that year, but then a year later or 5 years later, the tree is still cut and the carbon ends up in the atmosphere. How do you credit and what kind of rates do you use to credit that removal or reduction over 1 year? And different approaches have been used. There was early pioneering work by people like Pedro Maracosta and others from 10, 15, even 20 years ago, I think, on this. And the most conservative approach would be actually to look at 100-year discounting. So you could say that versus a 100-year or permanent credit, you might discount by, to 1% each year that you keep that carbon out of the atmosphere, and it's still a net value. And there's all sorts of good analysis you can find online and graphs if you look up tenure accounting. But there were others that were proposing more aggressive discount rates along the lines of what we've been discussing that actually could create like a 1/25 years. So so you basically get 4% instead of 1% of the value each year. And there were good cases to be made around that and some good evidence. Again, you could probably find some of that online. NCX did a lot of good work on this, including their projects in the US of the improved forest management around tenure. And to the question of why it didn't make its way through to be approved, I would say the concept was generally or fairly widely supported, not by everyone, the tenure, but by most people, for this kind of conversation to drive early and wide climate action. But I think there was some concerns about how you'd actually achieve that on the ground and whether to make or to ensure that the activities, for example, forest management or whatever was employing tenure, that it was a additional and defensible activity. And I think that's really where, some of the other broader questions came up that ultimately led Verra to punt and not actually launch the tenure approach in the near term. But I think there's a lot of support for it. I think we absolutely need that kind of approach. And I think it could, unlock a lot of new actions that currently aren't credited. I think it could prioritize early action. And I think it could drive a lot of innovation in this space.
Ben, you've got a couple questions here. Are you familiar with the IASB 37 and 38 to put carbon offsetting on the balance sheet?
I'm not intimately familiar with it, but I'll give you, I was just reading some of the other questions as well. And I think just listening to what everybody's saying, it's super interesting because I think we spent a lot of time talking about the price of carbon and discount rates. And I was kind of saying here, going, okay, well, fundamentally, if you look at functioning markets today, whether it's the bond market, the commodities market, and I tend to prefer those markets because they're based in reality. The bond market is about, financing real things, and the commodity market is about, real things like, whether it's wheat or oil or whatever it is. There's a real physical object beneath that. And fundamentally, and I'm sure that purists will identify a lot of things I missed, but the way I think about those markets is fundamentally they all have a forward pricing curve, right? And that forward pricing curve, how much is this going to be worth 1 year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, is driven basically out of three things. One is the quality, right? And I think here that's why the work from ICVCM and a lot of the standards work is so important. Is actually and the the ratings agency as well, because it's ultimately going to give us a framework that allows for that fungibility between different credits and all different types of projects. And I think that's really important because there is an important element in terms of the price around that. The second is supply and demand. And I think that for me is like the big what's missing to really fuel this market, because and the third is really around macro events, right? And for what we're talking about, those macro events are, you know, disasters. They could also be regulation and policy and things like that, and they obviously will have an impact. But when I come back to supply and demand, I think, and it kind of legs into the question I think that Luke Pritchard asked is fundamentally, I think the way we think about emissions disclosure today is ultimately what needs to be fixed to really start thinking about fixing price down the road, because therein lies effectively, you know, the liability aspect of what we're talking about. And obviously, you know, there's nuance between public and private sectors and all the rest of it. But today, the reality is that companies, you know, they've got the, you know, idealistic benchmarks. They've got the top-down what's good for the planet benchmarks, but there doesn't really exist this notion of what's technically feasible for this sector, this country, etc. And I think that's a really important missing element in this. The reason I think it's important is because ultimately the what's technically feasible should be the defining factor between what is a compliance market versus what is a voluntary market, and therefore should be the defining factor in terms of building demand. And I think demand for the voluntary carbon markets is the thing that is going to ultimately drive price. Having a structured approach to building demand, looking at a maturity-based approach is going to be really important. And then I think you get back to the time, kind of, you know, this conversation about is it better to buy things now versus in the future, is if a company, you know, or an emitting entity is more, you know, thinks about emissions as something that needs to be quote unquote financed over time, then they're going to look at that forward pricing curve and say, you know what, it's cheaper for me to actually remove the emissions today than it is to actually, you know, want to finance that ton of carbon for a long time. So I kind of look at this space and just really feel that in the end, we're going to have to kind of meet somewhere in the middle in a way that builds an accounting framework that allows for there to be a maturity ladder of demand, which in turn is going to allow for there to be some, you know, some debate around what is a real forward price of carbon. And obviously the social good and all the rest of it needs to be factored into that. You have this public good element, which is, I think, the bit which is, it makes this so hard. But I think in the end, we've got to look at other markets and kind of take from some of those to be able to kind of look at this from both sides. And I think companies, you know, find it hard today to, you know, kind of really make that case internally for buying credits today, because the arguments are so much more, I think, intellectual than necessarily kind of, I can look at this price and tell you that it's going to be more expensive 5 years from now.
One thing that I have seen hold up demand is confusion over what to buy, or when to buy. It seems that we have conversations about nature-based and engineered. We have conversations about removals and reductions. And then I want to come and bring a conversation about when to buy and the different values at times. But now the new conversation I'm seeing is this like for like target, that you need to maybe think about your methane footprint is different than your carbon footprint, both in the areas in which these assets are stored and the types of gas that you're going after. How do we take on accurate carbon accounting, think about the accurate true value of projects and all the attributes of a carbon project without overcomplicating the asset class so much that it pushes buyers away from the table and they wait to see these things on a spreadsheet instead of, you know, supplied by a series of registries and brokers?
Yeah, Reid, it's a great question. I think it's part of this broader conversation about a ton is a ton and differentiation amongst assets and accounting regimes. I think there's you know, in some ways, a ton is a ton is sort of constraining us and actually leading to kind of a false sense of security and fungibility. Whereas actually, you know, increasingly we can provide the market and the standards bodies and the projects can provide transparency about what they're generating, what the assets look like. And that's not just on the carbon side and the timing of the emission reductions or removals, but also social and environmental values. And I think then in an informed market with sophisticated buyers and investors, they can make the decisions about what they want to support individually or on a portfolio basis. And so I think that is something that I would certainly like to see the market move more towards, is more transparency of information, more differentiation, not trying to shoehorn everything into one construct. And then I hope that we will see buyers that start to prioritize certain, accelerated emission reductions and activities and support work like ClimateWells and others are doing that's critical. And then we'll have other buyers that might be focused on long-term engineered removals and others that are on nature-based assets with a lot of co-benefits that could be generated and transitional value. And so I think there's a place for all of this, but I think it ends up being constrained artificially if we have this sort of a narrow construct of fungibility and a ton is a ton, rather than actually celebrating the differentiation and being transparent about that and clear about that and allowing buyers to engage across different areas.
I'd agree
Coming right
with
back. Sorry.
I was going to just say, I agree with Toby that there's a lot to be explored here in terms of creating some different asset classes and different ways for buyers to explore this. I think this is an area where I'd love to see some more innovation from the right groups in. I think theoretically, we all have ideas on what this could look like. I'm curious where the communication aspects for a buyer to whoever is eventually he or she needs to convince how this needs to be structured. I think we need to see some models and some different versions of this and then see what plays out and what's successful. Love to see that.
Yeah, I think the one thing I want to caution for is that it doesn't become an obstacle for or a reason for inaction, right? I think if that makes your the decision to purchase easier, fantastic. If it's an excuse for not to purchase, then I think that's the wrong thing to focus on. That should not be the blocking factor.
With the long list of things to consider when you're looking at a carbon credit project, and Toby, I'm coming to you, and maybe give us a minute or two commercial in how you're with your new company trying to take on some of the certification of the long list of new supply that's coming to market.
Yeah, thanks, Reid. Well, we're obviously talking about primarily in this webinar about climate action and the importance of that happening now and in the near term, and also of reducing emissions from super pollutants or other emission sources that are front-loaded or will have an outsized impact in the near term. So that's critical, as we've all been discussing. At the same time, there's challenges within the market of actually getting carbon projects certified and credits issued. And, in most of the certainly traditional registries, but even others now, it can take 18 months to 24, even 30 months to get a carbon project through certification and have credits issued, at least in the first round of verification. So that's a long delay, and that can create a lot of strain on projects, both with its financing and implementation and certainly scaling. And so what we're doing at Credegra, which is a new startup using AI basically to help streamline the certification journey, is using AI to support projects so that they can become compliant with whatever standards and methodologies they're choosing to use. And through that can, basically get to a compliant project with the required documentation in short order, a lot faster than they currently do. And then also that can go on to provide more assurance to both the auditors and the certification bodies and the standards registries that they can then actually fast track the certification and issuance of credits from those projects using these AI tools we're building. So we hope that will really make a difference and help accelerate and grease the wheels in terms of the process, and will help bring to market much quicker a lot of these carbon credits from great projects. And obviously we're talking about the early action ones or ones that are happening now, but we need to get those into the market and build confidence that, the uncertainty that the credits materialize so that buyers can count on them. They can start to build them into their, vintage matching or inventories and other accounting frameworks like SBTI or VCMI, et cetera. And so, we hope to play a role with that. And there's a lot of other great work around DMRV that's happening in this space, digital monitoring, reporting, and verification using technology and remote sensing. and other machine learning to help these projects again get sort of the accounting dialed in quickly, bring more transparency and assurance to the crediting and to the buyers. So I think all these things are going to be critical. We need to create a more efficient, scalable market that's more transparent and can be more trusted and scaled to meet the climate challenge.
Excited
And Reid,
to
I
see where
just
that goes.
saw, yeah, just quickly, I saw Luke had a question about, the current corporate net zero frameworks, what don't recognize or reward fast acting, fast acting climate action. I think one thing to note, like if we look at SBTI, which is obviously Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is something that a lot of corporates rely on to, dock their climate leadership commitments and claims into. Within this SBTI framework, they talk about companies needing to set science-based targets to roughly halve emissions before 2030. So right there, you have a very strong signal from one of the leading players in this space that's telling companies they need to reduce emissions or half emissions by 2030. And I think we need to extend that logic then to market-based instruments. So if we're looking at carbon credits and so forth, when we're thinking about beyond value chain mitigation or other approaches that companies need to build or bring in carbon credits into their overall climate action or leadership, we should be looking at the same kind of lens of halving emissions by 2030. And I think that alone will drive a lot of and prioritize a lot of these early actions we've been discussing.
How does that focus on 2030 balance against projects that are, as we see, heavily invested in, especially in the removal side, that may not deliver until 2035, 2040, 2045? If we're here talking about how the immediacy of impact matters, how do we balance that against what we're seeing from large tech companies who may be investing in things that are, quite far from delivery?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I'd love to hear what the other panelists have to say. I mean, I think, it's not any one solution. We need all of the above. And certainly it's important to invest in these long-term engineered and other removals solutions. But we have to be honest about the timing, the cost, the scalability. And so if we're even just looking at removals, nature-based removals with reforestation, ecosystem restoration, et cetera, can generate a lot faster removals at a lot lower cost with more co-benefits than a lot of engineered removals. And so we need to bring those into the portfolio and make sure those aren't being shortchanged. And then, of course, we need to bring in emission reductions, like we said, especially these early actions and short lived climate pollutants, but even CO2. And so I think it's not that we're trying to denigrate long-term investment and actions in bringing down the cost curve for some of these new technologies and engineered, excuse me, but they're not going to be enough alone. And we need to be honest about that and make sure that we're not shortchanging these other opportunities, especially that can generate co-benefits or help with the transition to a sustainable climate pathway.
I think, unfortunately, we're building a portfolio with a pool of capital that's way too small. And in that portfolio, the allocations at the moment don't make scientific sense. I think there's an over allocation to things that seem simple, or I think that's the wrong word, but that seem straightforward and are easy to explain. This silver bullet mentality, and there's an under allocation to things that are unsexy and that are more complex to talk about. And I think there's a realignment that needs to be done. And if that that pool of capital stays the same, that is a not fun conversation, because that means like moving money from one pot to another. So what we need to do is we need to increase this pool of capital, and I think that's because we do need it all. It's just that we need to rebalance the portfolio to something that drives impact at the right time and prioritizes impact in the right way.
I mean, I think somewhat, the thing I worry about is that today, at least what I've observed is I think we tend to focus on a lot of top-down benchmarks, and a lot of kind of what's good for the planet, which makes complete sense, and I completely understand that. But what we also know is that we haven't got anywhere close to making any progress. If you look at the increase of the carbon budget year on year, if you go back 5 years and you look at the beautiful diagram that gets presented every year at COP, it's the same diagram, it just gets moved forward a year. And so I think for me, one of the conversations which we tend to shy away from maybe is the what's technically feasible conversation. And I really believe that from a corporate and actually both public and private perspective, there is a second set of benchmarks, which is what do we agree is technically feasible? What do we think this sector can actually achieve in this given year? And that's obviously going to be very different to, halving your emissions by 2030 or whatever, depending on which sector you're in. And so I think therein maybe lies one of the data points that is needed to actually differentiate between, what is the compliance market, what are allocations that should be set for emitting companies that need to go down year on year, versus what therefore needs to be, the premise of demand in the VCM market. And I think obviously those lines converge over time, but I think in the near term, they're quite far apart. And I think one of the risks that maybe we face is that companies look at the halve your emissions by 2030 and kind of go, well, I'm never going to be able to do that, so why try? And the reason I think that's important, and fundamentally it is an accounting and a policy and a verification, and there's also people involved in that. But I think in the end, we're kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right? just to bring it back to where we started, in the sense that what is technically feasible. I think we want everybody to do everything that they can, and do it in a way where they feel safe and protected. And so then I think you get into, I think about maturity-based credits, and actually emissions in the same vein, which is, we know this is going to change over time. We know that there's going to be changes in standards. We know that there's going to be changes in opinions about how much an emission is, whether it's a ton or a ton and a half and all the rest of it. And I think we need to create a framework that allows companies and buyers of offsets to go, to know that, what they did in 2025 was 2025. And then in 2026, the benchmark may change, but they're not going to get, hauled over the coals for what happened in 2025. To draw an analogy, in the CDS, the credit default swap market, the way ISDA and ISDA contracts were constructed was that they evolved over time. And so what that allowed for was the quality and the standards got better year on year, but people didn't have to worry about what they did the year before because they were covered by a framework. So my point, and I come at this from a different perspective, which is, how do we bring private capital into these markets? How do we create demand and therefore create opportunity for private capital? I think the one thing that everybody probably does agree on is that we're nowhere near enough capital investing in this space to incentivize innovation and drive change. And I think fundamentally we've got to think through, how do we do that? And I think one of the ways to do that is to build a framework that allows for people to get a return on the capital they're investing. So it's not just philanthropic or off-balance sheet capital.
Well, we're right at 11 here. We've been able to handle quite a few questions. So thank you to all the attendees and to my esteemed panelists for talking about speed in the carbon market, financial markets, and in climate projects. We will have a recording that we'll send out to everybody. We'll have a link on our website. Please continue any post-panel conversations on the topic. If you have any questions for me or anybody else, feel free to reach out. But thank you so much for your time today. Hope you all have a great rest of your week. Thank you for everyone attending and participating.
Thank you, Reid. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Reid.
Have a great day.
Good to see you, everyone.
Thanks, Reid.